The first thing I heard when I walked into the ballroom wasn't music or laughter, it was her voice. "Oh, great," Sloane Whitmore whispered to her bridesmaids, her tone sharp and amused. "The country girl is here." She didn't bother lowering her voice. She wanted me to hear it. Her friends laughed softly, designer dresses rustling as if that somehow made the insult classier. Sloane didn't even look at me. To her, I wasn't a person. I was a flaw in her perfect engagement party, an embarrassing detail she hadn't been able to edit out. Someone who didn't belong in a room filled with crystal chandeliers and expensive champagne. If this story touched your heart, friends, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more touching stories. Thank you for being here. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I owned the building she was standing in. 3 years ago, I signed the deed to the Monarch Hotel. Every chandelier above her head, every glass in her hand, every polished marble tile beneath her heels belonged to me. And before this night was over, that careless whisper was going to cost her far more than her pride. My name is Bethany Burns. I'm 31 years old and I grew up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business and no one ever forgot where you came from. I have an older brother, Garrett. Growing up, he was everything I wasn't. Confident, successful, loved. In my family, Garrett was the standard and I was the comparison that always fell short. If I did well, Garrett did better. If I tried, Garrett excelled. My mother never openly criticized me, but her disappointment lived in her silence, in the way she praised Garrett and merely acknowledged me. I always felt like a rough draft while he was the final version. So when I turned 18, I left. One suitcase, $200, no safety net. I didn't leave because I hated my home. I left because there was no room for me in it. The city was unforgiving. I lived in tiny apartments and survived on cheap food. I took a job as a cleaning attendant at a small boutique hotel, scrubbing bathrooms and changing sheets for people who never noticed my face. But I noticed everything. I watched how hotels worked, how guests were treated, how money moved quietly behind the scenes. I asked questions, I learned. I moved from housekeeping to front desk, then to assistant manager, then to manager. I saved relentlessly, invested carefully, and took risks only when they made sense. By 28, I owned my first property. By 30, I owned 3. By 31, I was the CEO of Birch Hospitality, a company with 6 boutique hotels across the East Coast. The Monarch was my flagship, the one I was most proud of. I never told my family. They never asked. To them, I was still the struggling little sister who couldn't compete with Garrett in his respectable, ordinary job. So there I stood in the entrance of my own hotel, wearing simple clothes, my boots still carrying the faint scent of countryside roads. My outfit didn't scream money, and that was intentional. Real wealth doesn't need to announce itself. Across the room, Sloane smiled like she owned everything she saw. Garrett stood beside her, proud and oblivious. She thought I was nothing. I smiled to myself and walked toward the bar. Let her believe it. I had learned long ago that the most powerful revenge doesn't shout. It waits, it watches, and it lets people destroy themselves while they're too busy looking down to notice the ground shifting beneath their feet. She thought I was just some nobody from a small town, but she had no idea she was standing inside my empire. The engagement party was exactly what I expected from someone like Sloane, extravagant, excessive, and designed to impress people who already believed they were important. Ice sculptures shaped like swans stood near the dance floor, slowly melting under the whites. A champagne fountain flowed endlessly, and floral arrangements crowded every corner of the room. It looked expensive, but none of it felt personal. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, quietly observing. My staff moved with flawless coordination, and despite everything, I felt proud. The event was running smoothly. If nothing else, the Monarch was doing its job perfectly. That's when my mother approached me. Patricia Burns walked toward me with the same expression she'd worn my entire life. Polite on the surface, critical underneath. Her eyes flicked over my clothes and stopped at my boots. "You couldn't dress more appropriately," she asked. "Sloane's family is very refined." She said the word like it carried weight, like it was something I lacked. I told her I'd come straight from work and didn't have time to change. That much was true. I just didn't explain that work meant running a hospitality company worth millions. She sighed, that familiar, disappointed sigh, and reminded me to make a good impression on the Widmores before disappearing back into the crowd. 20 seconds of conversation and I felt 12 years old again, like no matter what I accomplished, it was never enough. Across the room, Sloane was in her element. She moved effortlessly from guest to guest, smiling, laughing, air-kissing cheeks like a seasoned socialite. Every gesture was practiced, every expression calculated. Her parents stood nearby, watching proudly. Franklin Whitmore was large and confident, his voice booming whenever he laughed. Delilah looked polished and elegant, draped in jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. But something about them felt off. Delilah kept touching her necklace nervously, as if it might disappear. Garrett finally noticed me and walked over. My older brother gave me a brief hug, already distracted. He talked about Sloane, about how incredible she was, about how lucky he felt. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Mom gave Sloane Grandma's necklace, he said casually, as an engagement gift. She loved it. I felt the air leave my lungs. The necklace, my grandmother's necklace, the antique pendant she had promised me before she died. She'd held my hand and told me it belonged to me, because I was the dreamer, the fighter, the one who would make something of herself. My mother was there when she said it. I scanned the room and I saw it immediately, sparkling around Sloane's neck, worn like it had always belonged to her. The music suddenly felt too loud. My chest tightened and I needed air. I excused myself and walked toward the hallway, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard Franklin Whitmore's voice. He was on his phone, speaking in a low, tense tone. He said they needed this wedding to happen, that the Burns family had money, enough to fix their situation. He said they just had to get through the ceremony. I froze in the hallway. What money? My parents didn't have wealth. Garrett had a stable but ordinary job. There was no hidden fortune. So why did Franklin Whitmore believe there was? I stood there, my grandmother's necklace momentarily forgotten, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Something about this engagement wasn't right, and for the first time that night, I wasn't just hurt, I was suspicious. That was the moment I realized this wedding wasn't about love, it was about desperation, and my family was the target. Once I heard Franklin Whitmore's phone call, I couldn't unhear it. The words replayed in my head as I re-entered the ballroom. They needed this wedding. The Burns family had money just to get through the ceremony. Whatever the Whitmores were hiding, it wasn't small, and it certainly wasn't accidental. I stopped watching the decorations and started watching people. Franklin Whitmore smiled too much. Every time his phone buzzed, his jaw tightened before he forced another laugh. He excused himself more than once, disappearing toward the hallway with the same stiff posture, as if he were holding something together by sheer will. Delilah Whitmore looked elegant, but her confidence felt brittle. She adjusted her jewelry constantly, fingers brushing over rings and bracelets as if she needed to reassure herself they were still there. Wealth didn't usually behave that way. Real money was relaxed. This looked like fear dressed up as luxury. And Sloane, perfect, radiant Sloane, had something sharp behind her eyes. It wasn't excitement, it was hunger. She watched every interaction carefully, especially anyone connected to my family. When guests congratulated her, she smiled, but her grip on Garrett's arm tightened, like she was afraid he might slip away. That's when I understood. They thought my family had money. But why? The answer hit me slowly, then all at once. For the past 4 years, I had been sending money to my parents anonymously. Mortgage payments, utility bills, medical expenses. When my father needed surgery, the bill was paid before my mother even saw it. I never signed my name. I never explained. I didn't want gratitude or questions. I just wanted to help without reopening old wounds. My parents never knew it was me, and in my mother's mind, there was only one possible explanation: Garrett. Of course she assumed it was him, her successful son, her reliable son. I could practically hear her bragging to friends about how generous Garrett was, how he quietly took care of the family. Every payment I made, every sacrifice I carried, had been credited to my brother. The Whitmores must have noticed. A nice house with no visible financial stress, bills always paid on time, a mother who spoke proudly of her son's investments. To the wrong people, it probably looked like hidden wealth, and predators notice things like that. I felt a chill settle in my chest. The Whitmores weren't celebrating love. They were securing an escape route. Garrett wasn't a fiancé. He was a lifeline. I needed confirmation.
I found Wesley Crane, my general manager, near the service corridor, clipboard in hand as he supervised the catering staff. When he saw me, his professional expression softened slightly. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. "I need a favor." He didn't hesitate. That's why I trusted him. "I need background information on the Whitmore family. Business records, news articles, anything public or questionable, quietly." Wesley's brows knit together, but he didn't ask why. He simply nodded and pulled out his phone. "I'll see what I can find." As he walked away, I returned to the ballroom, keeping my expression neutral. That's when Sloane appeared beside me. Up close, she smelled expensive, perfume layered over ambition. Her smile was sweet, almost friendly. "We should talk," she said lightly, placing a hand on my arm as if we were already close. "Get to know each other better." She guided me toward a quieter corner near the restrooms. The moment we were out of earshot, her smile vanished. "I know about you." I said nothing. She tilted her head, studying me. "Sending money home every month? Playing the good daughter from a distance?" She laughed softly. "I just don't understand why someone who barely survives would waste money on people who don't even like her." My jaw tightened, but I kept my face calm. "Unless," she continued, leaning closer, "you're trying to buy their love. Pathetic, really." She straightened, smiled returning like a mask snapping back into place. "Garrett told me everything about you. The jealousy, the resentment. Honestly, I think it would be better for everyone if you stayed out of our lives." She walked away without waiting for a response. I watched her go, heart steady, mind clear. Sloane thought I was broke. She had no idea who she was standing in front of, and Wesley was about to find out exactly who she was. She believed she had all the power, but she had no idea she was threatening the one person who could destroy everything she'd built. Sloane's words should have shaken me. Years ago, they would have. Back when I still believed my worth was tied to my family's approval, her cruelty might have cut deep. But standing there in my own hotel, listening to a woman who thought I was powerless, I felt something very different. Clarity. She wasn't confident, she was terrified. People who are truly secure don't feel the need to belittle others in dark corners. They don't threaten. They don't expose what they believe is your weakness. They smile and move on. Sloane did none of those things. She attacked because she was scared. I returned to the ballroom and forced myself to blend in, nodding politely when spoken to, smiling when expected. Inside, my mind was working quickly, connecting pieces that had been scattered for years. The Whitmores had chosen my brother deliberately. They hadn't fallen into this family by chance. They were running. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Wesley found me again. He approached quietly, his expression tight, professional calm barely holding together. "We need to talk," he said under his breath. He led me into an empty service corridor and handed me his phone. On the screen were documents, articles, and legal summaries. The deeper I scrolled, the colder I felt. The Whitmores were drowning in debt. Not ordinary debt, investigation-level debt. Lawsuits, frozen accounts, failed real estate developments. Several articles referenced missing investor funds and suspicious financial structures. Their business empire wasn't an empire, it was a carefully staged illusion. "They're being investigated," Wesley said quietly. "Multiple states, nothing officially charged yet, but it's bad." I exhaled slowly. So Franklin's phone call wasn't paranoia, it was desperation. But then I scrolled further. "Wait," I said, "that's not Sloane." Wesley nodded. I noticed that too. Her legal name, buried deep in a court filing from Arizona, wasn't Sloane Whitmore. It was Sandra Williams. Different name, same face. And the pattern didn't stop there. The Whitmores, if that was even their real name, had been connected to similar ventures in 2 other states. Same structure, same sudden disappearance when investors started asking questions. New identities, new towns, new targets. "This engagement," I said slowly, "isn't real." Wesley looked at me carefully. "No," he agreed. "It's a lifeboat." I thanked him and told him to keep digging. Quietly. He didn't ask what I planned to do, and I didn't explain. Some things were better left unsaid until the moment they mattered. I stepped outside into the parking garage, needing space to think. The overhead lights flickered as I leaned against my car, reading through the documents again. This wasn't a simple scam. It was a long-running operation, decades maybe, and my brother had walked straight into it. Part of me wanted to let it collapse. Let Garrett learn the truth the hard way. Let my mother face the consequences of her choices, and the Whitmores simply disappear when they realized there was no money to steal. No, if this ended, it would end completely. I pulled out my phone and made the first call. My lawyer answered on the second ring. I need you to verify something, and I need it fast. Then I made a second call to a forensic accountant who owed me a favor and loved uncovering lies more than sleep. When I ended the calls, my hands were steady. The pieces were moving. All that remained was timing. And timing, in this case, would be everything. I didn't walk back into the ballroom as a guest. I walked back in as someone preparing to end a con that had gone on for years.
I returned to the ballroom with a calm that surprised even me. Nothing outward had changed. The music still played, the guests still laughed, and Sloane still smiled as if the night belonged to her. But underneath the glitter and noise, everything had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was directing. My lawyer called first. She confirmed what Wesley had found and then went further. The Whitmores were already on a federal radar. Names, shell companies, and timelines matched multiple open investigations. They hadn't been charged yet because they kept moving, changing identities, and attaching themselves to new sources of money. Families like mine. The forensic accountant called next. Her voice carried that shark excitement professionals get when the numbers finally confess. She had traced transactions across states and years. It wasn't just fraud. It was a pattern, polished and repeated. And Sloane Whitmore did not exist anywhere that mattered legally. Her real name, Sandra Williams, appeared in filings from Arizona tied to a collapsed development that had wiped out dozens of investors. Same parents, same smiles, same exit strategy. This wedding was never meant to last. I looked across the room at Garrett. He was laughing at something Sloane said, unaware that the woman beside him was already planning her escape. I felt anger, yes, but also responsibility. If I waited, he would be destroyed quietly. If I acted, it would be loud. I chose loud. I found Wesley again and gave him a simple instruction: prepare the audio-visual system. He didn't ask why, he just nodded, already understanding that whatever was coming would be irreversible. Next, I sent one message to my lawyer: coordinate with investigators tonight. She replied with a single word: done. At 8:55 p.m., Franklin Whitmore adjusted his tie and moved toward the small stage. Guests began turning, glasses raised, ready for the sentimental toast. Sloane squeezed Garrett's hand, radiant and rehearsed. I stood near the back of the room, unseen, watching every detail. My phone vibrated. Investigators were outside, waiting for confirmation. All they needed was public evidence. Once exposed, the Whitmores couldn't vanish. Franklin tapped the microphone. The music faded. He began speaking about family, about legacy, about trust. Each word felt heavier than the last, knowing how false it all was. When he raised his glass and said, "To love and forever," I sent one word to Wesley: now. The screens behind the stage flickered. The slideshow of happy couple photos vanished, replaced by a court document stamped with official seals. Then another, then another. Names, dates, fraud allegations, and financial trails filled the room in silent succession. The laughter died instantly. Whispers spread like shockwaves. Franklin's face drained of color. Sloane's smile cracked, then shattered. Garrett stared at the screens, then at her, confusion turning to horror. Franklin tried to spook, to laugh it off as a mistake, but the evidence kept coming. Photos, articles, a name in bold letters: Sandra Williams. The truth had arrived, and it was not gentle. Chairs scraped as guests stood, unsure whether to leave or stay. Someone dropped a glass, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Sloane's parents moved toward the exit, panic breaking through their composure, but security stepped in calmly, firmly. Garrett whispered Sloane's name, searching her face for denial, for explanation, for anything real. She said nothing. The room held its breath as authority replaced celebration, and every lie she had worn like silk unraveled in public, irreversible strands. No one cheered. That justice felt louder than applause ever could in that moment there. The engagement party was officially over, but the consequences were just beginning. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the room itself needed time to understand what had just happened. The music was silent. The champagne fountain kept flowing, completely unaware that the celebration it was meant for had just died. Sloane was the first to react. "This is a lie," she said sharply, her voice slicing through the stunned quiet. She laughed once, loud and forced. "This is some kind of sick joke." But her hands were shaking. Garrett looked at her like he was seeing a stranger wearing his fiancé's face. "Sloane," he said slowly, "what is this? Why is your picture on those documents? Why did it say your name isn't Sloane?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time all night, she didn't have a perfectly timed answer ready. Franklin Whitmore stepped forward, forcing a smile that no longer convinced anyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hands, "there's clearly been a misunderstanding. These screens have been hacked. We'll sort this out privately." No one believed him. The documents kept rotating automatically. Fraud investigations, frozen accounts, shell companies, and finally arrest warrants issued in another state. The room erupted in whispers. Guests leaned toward each other, phones already out, recording what would undoubtedly be tomorrow's headline. Then the ballroom doors opened. 4 federal agents walked in calmly, badges visible, expressions professional, and unmoved by the chaos they were stepping into. The lead agent scanned the room once and then focused on Franklin. "Franklin Whitmore, or whatever name you're currently using, you are under arrest for wire fraud, investment fraud, and conspiracy." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was louder than any music that had played that night. Delilah Whitmore gasped and grabbed Franklin's arm, mascara already streaking down her face. "There's been a mistake," she cried. "We can explain everything." The agent didn't respond. Sloane took a step back, then another. Her eyes darted wildly across the room, looking for an exit, for an ally, for control. When she realized there was none, she turned toward Garrett. "You're really going to let this happen?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You know me. You love me." Garrett hesitated. I saw the war behind his eyes, the future he had imagined battling the reality unfolding in front of him. Slowly, painfully, he pulled his hand out of hers. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly. That broke her. Her expression twisted from desperation into fury, and her gaze snapped at me. "This is your fault. You did this. You were always jealous, always useless. You're nothing, just a nobody from nowhere." I stepped forward then. The crowd parted instinctively, eyes wide as realization spread. Wesley's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce the owner of the Monarch Hotel and CEO of Birch Hospitality, Ms. Bethany Burns." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's face drained of color. Garrett stared at me as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Sloane froze, her mouth slightly open, her carefully constructed world collapsing in real time. I took the microphone from Franklin's slack hand. "Good evening," I said calmly. "I'm sorry to interrupt the celebration, but I felt everyone deserved to know the truth about who they were celebrating." Sloane laughed hysterically. "You expect them to believe you? You're lying!" I met her eyes. Am I also lying about the investigators outside, or the arrest warrants, or your real name, Sandra Williams? Her knees buckled slightly. The agent stepped forward, and security moved in. Sloane screamed as they grabbed her arms, thrashing wildly. "You can't do this to me. I was supposed to win. I was supposed to be somebody." As they dragged her toward the exit, she hurled one last insult at me. "You're still that stinky country girl." I leaned in close enough that only she could hear. "And this stinky country girl owns the building you're being arrested in." She went silent. The doors closed behind them, leaving the room in stunned disbelief. The engagement party was officially over.
The illusion was shattered. Guests slowly began to breathe again, murmuring, processing, whispering. Garrett stood frozen near the center of the room, his entire future erased in less than 10 minutes. I looked around once more at the chandeliers, the guests, the mess of broken lies, and felt something unexpected. Not triumphs, relief, because the truth was finally out, and nothing, not even family, could hide from it anymore. With the con exposed and the arrests made, I thought the worst was over, but the hardest confrontations were still waiting. When the doors closed behind the agents, the ballroom felt unfamiliar, like a stage after the final act. Decorations still shimmered under the lights, champagne still poured, but the celebration was gone. People spoke in hushed voices, unsure whether to leave or pretend nothing extraordinary had happened. Garrett stood near the center of the room, motionless. His shoulders were tense, his expression blank, like someone trying to process a reality that had arrived too fast. I watched him from a distance, wondering if this was the moment we finally spoke honestly, or if the gap between us would widen again. He turned and walked toward me. "How long did you know?" he asked quietly. "Long enough to stop it," I said. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that answer. After a moment, he exhaled and said, "You saved me." The words surprised us both. Garrett had always been the one everyone relied on. Admitting he had needed help didn't come easily to him. I told him the truth, that I didn't do it for recognition, and I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because letting the lie continue would have destroyed him, and I couldn't allow that. Before either of us could say more, my mother approached. Patricia Burns looked older than she had earlier that evening. The confidence she usually carried was gone, replaced by uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. Instead, I took out my phone and showed her the records. Every payment, every transfer, 4 years of support. "It was me," I said. "All of it." She stared at the screen, then at me, shock and realization colliding in her eyes. Her voice shook when she whispered my name. "I thought it was Garrett." "I know. That's the problem." Tears filled her eyes, not the controlled kind she saved for public moments, but real ones. There was no dramatic apology, no excuses. Just silence and understanding settling between us for the first time in years. A soft clink echoed nearby. We turned to see the necklace lying on the floor. My grandmother's necklace. Garrett walked over and picked it up carefully, examining the familiar pendant with reverence. "She promised this to you," he said quietly. Then he placed it in my hand. The weight of it felt grounding, like something important had finally returned home. My mother watched, her expression heavy with regret, but she didn't interrupt. Some moments didn't need words. I addressed the remaining guests shortly after. I told them they were free to leave or stay. The food had already been paid for. The bar would remain open. A few nervous laughs followed, easing the tension just enough for people to breathe again. One by one, guests filtered out, glancing back as if trying to memorize the night they'd be telling for years. When the room finally emptied, I stood alone, the necklace resting against my palm. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel revenge. I felt closure. Not because everything was fixed, but because the truth was no longer hidden, and sometimes that's where healing actually begins. 3 weeks later, the Monarch Hotel felt peaceful again. The chaos of that night had faded into something quieter, headlines replaced by routine, shock replaced by structure. The lobby hummed with normal life, rolling suitcases, soft conversations, the clink of coffee cups from the cafe. From the outside, no one would guess what had happened here. That suited me just fine. The Whitmores were finished. Federal charges had been filed within days. Wire fraud, investment fraud, conspiracy. The evidence shown that night opened doors investigators had been trying to break down for years. Sandra Williams, formerly Sloan Whitmore, was being held without bail, her multiple identities finally collapsing into one permanent record. No new reinvention this time, no new town, no new family to drain. The story ran in the news for about a week. Hotel owner exposes engagement scam. Fake heiress arrested at engagement party. One headline made me laugh, despite myself. The country girl who owned the room. I had it framed and hung in my office, not out of ego, but as a reminder of how easily people underestimate what they don't understand. Garrett came to see me for the first time since that night, not as my brother attending a family obligation, but as a man who genuinely wanted to know who I was. He stood in my office, looking around quietly, at the skyline, at the staff moving with purpose beyond the glass walls, at my name on the door. It was clear he was trying to reconcile the sister he thought he knew with the reality in front of him. I never asked, he admitted finally. I just assumed. I told him that assumption had shaped most of my life. We went to lunch after, not a rushed meal filled with polite silence, but a real conversation. We talked about childhood, about expectations, about how differently we'd experienced the same family. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That mattered more than anything else. My mother called me 2 days later. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. She told me she had started therapy, not because anyone told her to, because she realized she didn't understand why she had treated me the way she did. She said she wanted to learn how to stop measuring love like a competition. I didn't forgive her on the spot, but I didn't hang up either. That was progress. Life moved forward. One morning, I hosted a small business breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Investors, partners, people with influence and confidence. Normal business. As the meeting started, a young woman hesitated near the entrance. Simple clothes, nervous posture, clearly out of place. One of the guests muttered something about the event being private. I stood up. I walked over to her and smiled. I took her hand and introduced her to the table. I said, "This is Nicole Patterson. She's this year's Birch Hospitality Scholarship recipient." I told her her story, small-town background, 2 jobs, community college. Accepted into a top hospitality program through sheer determination. The room went quiet. Nicole looked overwhelmed. I leaned in and told her not to thank me yet. I said the real work was just beginning, but she belonged here as much as anyone else. After the meeting, I watched her walk through the lobby, a little straighter than when she'd entered. That was when I realized something important. That night wasn't just about exposing a lie. It was about reclaiming space, about refusing to stay small just to make others comfortable, about choosing visibility, not for validation, but for impact. People will always try to define you by where you came from. Let them. While they're busy doing that, you can be building something they never imagined. I thought my story ended with justice, but the final lesson was still waiting, and it was bigger than revenge. The morning light poured through the tall windows of the Monarch Hotel, casting long reflections across the marble floor. I stood in the lobby with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching guests move in and out, business travelers checking their watches, families juggling luggage, couples laughing quietly as they planned their day. None of them knew my story. None of them needed to. That was the strange beauty of it. For most of my life, I thought being seen was the goal. I thought if my family acknowledged me, if people finally understood what I had felt, then everything would feel complete.
But standing there, surrounded by something I created from nothing, I realized I didn't need recognition to feel whole. I needed peace. The Whitmore case moved quickly. When lies collapse all at once, there's no room left to hide. Sandra Williams pleaded not guilty at first, clinging to denial like it might still save her. It didn't. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple victims came forward. Old investors finally had names and faces to attach to the losses they'd carried for years. Garrett followed the case quietly. We talked more often now. Not every day, not perfectly, but honestly. The distance between us didn't disappear overnight, but it softened. He stopped assuming. He started asking. That alone changed everything. My mother tried to. Slowly. Awkwardly. She sent messages she'd clearly rewritten several times before pressing send. Sometimes they were clumsy. Sometimes they hurt. But they were real. And for the first time, I believed she was listening. Not to respond, not to defend herself, but to understand. Healing wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with apologies that fixed the past. It came in small, uneven steps, in pauses where there used to be judgment, in questions where there used to be silence. I let myself accept that. One afternoon, I walked through the Monarch with a group of interns, students from small towns, overlooked backgrounds, and uncertain beginnings. I told them my story without the scandal, without the drama, just the work, the failure, the persistence. I watched their faces change as they realized success didn't require permission. That mattered more than any headline ever had. Later that evening, I returned to the ballroom, the same one where everything had unraveled. It had been reset for a conference. Neutral decor, clean lines, no trace of the chaos that once filled the space. I stood where Sloane had once stood, convinced she owned the room. She never did. Power isn't borrowed. It isn't worn like a dress or borrowed through association. It's built quietly and deliberately over time, and once you understand that, no one can take it from you. I reached into my pocket and touched my grandmother's necklace, now a constant presence against my skin. She had seen something in me long before I saw it in myself. She knew I would build my own foundation instead of standing on someone else's. I finally understood what she meant. That night, as I prepared to leave the hotel, a young employee stopped me. She looked nervous, unsure if she should speak. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, for not pretending to be small. I smiled and told her the truth. I said I spent years pretending to be small because it felt safer, because standing out meant risking rejection. But the moment you stop shrinking, I said, you realize how much space you were always meant to take. She nodded, eyes bright, and walked away taller than before. As I stepped outside into the evening air, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who left home with a suitcase and no guarantees, the one who cleaned rooms while dreaming of more, the one who was dismissed, underestimated, and ignored. She would be proud. People will always try to define you by your past, by where you came from, by what they think you deserve. Let them try. Their limits don't belong to you. I walked back into my hotel one last time that night, not as the invisible sister, not as the country girl people whispered about, but as a woman who knew exactly who she was. And that was the real ending. They underestimated the girl from nowhere, but she didn't just rise. She built something that will stand long after they're forgotten. If today's story touched your heart or kept you hooked, you can show your love by sending a super thanks. Your support helps me continue creating more powerful life stories for you. Thank you truly for always being so kind and supportive. I can't wait to read your thoughts about this story. On your screen right now, you'll find 2 new stories that I highly recommend.
filled with emotions, twists, and lessons. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for many more inspiring life stories. Until the next one, sending you love, respect, and gratitude. See you in the next story.